All right. So, last but certainly not least for our first week, I really want to talk to you all about the research process. So, again, welcome back to Health Science 622 Research Methods and Program Evaluation. So, health research is different from other research, and it's actually a huge umbrella. It examines a broad spectrum of biological, socioeconomic, environmental, and other factors that contribute to the presence or absence of physical, mental, and social health and well-being. Again, huge umbrella. Population health research, which is a subset of health research, involves humans as the unit of investigation. So, me as a human, or you as a human, or our participants are the unit of investigation. We're interested in those people. There's a distinction between routine practice activities and health research. So, routine practice activities for registered dietitians, physical therapists, and others, and health researchers, those are different. So, doing research versus just what is normal, they're not the same. There's a lot of purposes for health research. Here's a few. These, are not. It's not, again, not an exhaustive list. There's needs assessment. So the community health profile. So we can do needs assessments at the university level, at the county level, at the state level, to kind of understand where those shortcomings are for that population health. There's also risk assessment. So what are some risk factors, or what's causing disease? There's applied practice, so clinical effectiveness. That includes new technology, new drugs, other things like that really are trying to improve clinical outcomes. And outcome evaluation. So how do interventions impact health? Again, not an exhaustive list. So there is the purpose, but then the process, and this is all research, not just health research, but it's a process of systematically and carefully investigating a subject in order to discover new insights about the world. Very vague definition, but it's true. And some of you might remember this. So the scientific method. So when we state a problem, formulate a hypothesis, design an experiment, collect data, analyze that data, and draw conclusions. So you might have learned this in elementary school. It hasn't really changed that much as a professional. So I use the scientific method every day. My mom was a fourth grade teacher, and we laugh about our conversations because we can understand each other very well. So again, that research process, I'll simplify it into 6 steps. So identify a study question. So you need to you want to answer this question in the universe. You want to select a study approach. So kind of how do you answer that question? And then you design a study based on that approach. Then you collect data. That after you design the study and you collect data using that design, you analyze that data, and you then share your findings with the research community. And when we think of research, we will read 1 paper or 2 papers, but your research, along with anybody else's, contributes to this larger body of evidence, even if the hypothesis was wrong. So even if what you hypothesized to happen didn't happen, it still contributes to this larger body. And no one study can stand alone. So we think, oh, well, if, we cite studies all the time and say, well, this study said that, but what does the other parts of that body of evidence state? And the method, so either if it's an experiment or however you decide to, design your study, must be repeatable. So other researchers can do your study again and potentially, hopefully, if done correctly and similarly, obtain similar results. All right, so a large part of the research, health research, any research, are variables. So an experiment is simply a way to determine if a change to one item causes a predictable change in another. So does A impact, effect, is associated with B? So these items A and B are variables. So A, when we think of a blank, so think about this. A blank variable is the one that is changed by the scientist, so me as a researcher, of a variable that is unaffected by a study. Then we have a blank variable changes and researchers observe what happens. So think about this for a second. I'm going to give you the answer on the next slide. It's in your slide deck if you have it. So again, an independent variable, or what I would call an exposure, is one that I can affect or assess. The dependent variable, or your outcome, changes. And we observe what happens to this variable. So I'm going to actually go through this. So again, an experiment is simply a way to determine if a change to one item causes a predictable change in another. So one good question to ask of science studies is, what did the researcher control for? So these are different types of variables. Controlled variables, often called confounders. So if you've taken epidemiology or biostatistics, if you've ever really read a paper, you might say we controlled for X, Y, and Z. We call them confounders, are items that me, the researcher, or you, the scientist, wants to keep constant. So they can influence how, the relationship between the exposure and the outcome, and influence the outcome. Of course, it is impossible to keep everything constant. So really, statisticians mathematically account for some expected variability. Again, you hopefully talked about this in one of your other classes, but we'll talk about it in future classes as well. So, but here's an example. So a researcher, say you, want to see if physical activity is associated with heart disease. So we might hypothesize that higher levels of physical activity are associated with lower risk of heart disease. So what's your independent variable? So think about that for a minute. So is it physical activity? Is it heart disease? Is it something else? What is the dependent variable, or the outcome you're looking for? Again, is it physical activity? Is it heart disease? Or is it something else? What variables should you control for? So think about this for a minute. Pause if you really want to take a second and kind of assess this, because I'm about to tell you. Because our independent variable, or our exposure, so what we either control or we assess in individuals, is physical activity. So we want to know how physical activity impacts our dependent variable, or our outcome, heart disease. The prompt doesn't really think about this. This is something you'll have to know as a researcher, or find out what other studies control for, to find potential confounding variables. So diet, affects physical activity, and maybe even heart disease, or definitely heart disease, I should say. Age, the older you get, the higher risk you are to have heart disease, but maybe you are less physically active. Think about it. Are there others? So maybe sex, or, there's like a million. Hypertension status, So again, think about this. And when you ask a question, when you're wanting to see if two things are associated, you're always going to have to think about confounding. So one huge step is designing your study. So you have to know study design. And again, there are some really great YouTube videos in the BB Learn shell, but there are a couple of types of study design. So observational or experimental. Under observational, you have case reports or case series. We don't usually think about those in public health. Those are more in the medical field, but not to say that they don't exist. Cross-sectional or prevalence studies, case control studies, and cohort studies. We will go through all of these this semester as a review because you should have a basis in these, but we'll talk about them this semester. We also have experimental studies. So what we as researchers we might think of as the gold standard. So randomized control or randomized clinical trials or cluster randomized control trials. Again, we'll talk more about these throughout the semester. For observational studies, there's some inferences you have to keep in mind. They're really only about descriptions and associations. So is something associated with each other. However, you can design an observational study to make these kind of stronger causal inferences with statistical adjustment and appropriate study design. However, experimental studies are the gold standard for determining cause and effect. So if we randomly assign everyone to be either really physically active or not physically active at all and follow them, and we say you have to be really physically active and you aren't, and follow them over time to see if they get heart disease, that's our gold standard. We are effectively assigning them their exposure. But in all studies, we really have to have careful definitions of our outcome, sometimes called disease, and our exposures and our risk factors. So definitions are very important, no matter what type of study. Again, there's great YouTube videos. I highly recommend you watching. They're optional, but I think you should. And then our text has great chapters on different study designs. And again, we have, thinking about study design and how we're doing it, we have so many options for our research product. So is it quantitative, qualitative, maybe a mix of the both, mixed methods? You could develop an intervention that would be maybe just a small piece of it. You might not actually carry out the intervention over the semester, but maybe designing one can be your product. We can come up with toolkits or trainings even, meta-analyses or systematic literature reviews, which we'll talk about in week 2. And then policy briefs or grant proposals. I'm sorry, week 3, policy briefs or grant proposals. Remember, assignment 1 is due this week, and I really want to know a little bit about your research product. This is proposal, but it's actually a product. It's not a proposal. And I really want you to tell me about it. So, what are your interests? What study who's maybe potentially your study population of interest, and also possible methods. And it's, again, your first step. So I look forward to seeing what you all come up with. And I am excited for week 2. So have a great week, first week of classes, and I will see you next time.